Thank you very much. I'd start a bit about my friend who is also one of the speakers here. I think he's speaking tomorrow, Gian Tamas from Hungary. He told me about the news coverage of this event in the German newspaper. And I've been told that one of the newspapers has said that those people organizing this and speaking in favor of communism are lazy in their thinking and they have a bad historical memory. So I was wondering, if we should also reflect on whether we are actually lazy in our thinking, which does not seem to me, particularly after such a paper, which goes all the way to Aristotle and Plato and Kant, in order to provide a substantiation of the idea of communism. So it looks to me that that communism is something which provides, in a way, without the idea of communism, it's something about capitalism which is even difficult for us to comprehend what capitalism is all about, to such an extent that it's positing the idea of communism which allows us to see what are the conditions conditions of existence of capitalism itself that makes it possible. And of course, the only thing is that then we see that it's class struggle, which in a way underpins capital. But by the time you come to this realization that it's actually classes and class struggle which provides the conditions of existence to capitalism itself, then of course you've already changed registers from our critiques to the idea of communism. And this is something which really struck me. I come from India, and in India, as you can hear from a lot of reports that come tied up with also the reports from China, that there is a booming capitalism happening, and neoliberalism is leading to high growth and a huge upper middle class, and finally these countries are coming up as also powers in the global field. And it all looks hunky-dory, it all looks fine, that capitalism is successful in so many ways, till actually you actually have a resistance to neoliberalism, to capitalism, which presupposes something like a revolutionary subjectivity. So it's only with the positing of a revolutionary subjectivity that the fact that things are not all fine, that capitalism is actually riven with internal contradictions become clear. So in a sense, the point really is that unless you actually posit a revolutionary subjectivity, even objective conditions as they are do not open up to show you the contradictions that it contains internally. So something which I think what Zizek was saying a moment ago about class struggle without classes or something, but that is something which seems to be the case, class struggle without classes, until you have a revolutionary intervention coming, yeah? And now in my country, the situation is that there is a revolutionary movement there, and it's in the light of the revolutionary movement that contradictions become sharper, and then you see state, capital, these collusions happening much more clearly. So it's not just that you analyze things and you have a critical theory with you which shows you what is in fact the case, what underlies capitalism and the underlying contradictions. It's rather actually the action, the reality, the actualization of the revolutionary intervention which brings these internal contradictions to the fore. And maybe this conference also will contribute to such a revolutionary intervention at some level to then actually reveal to us what actually underlies capitalism and its internal contradictions. My paper is called Communism, the Real Movement, and as you can see, when one is talking about the real movement, it is to also already trying to critique all the other possible left-wing, at least nominally left-wing positions that also posit some kind of a left-wing idea, whether it's social democracy or welfare state or rights for the underprivileged, the marginalized, but which does not really does not really carry on with this idea of a real movement, but which kind of ends up reproducing capital and the power of the state in so many ways. So, this term, communism, the real movement, is something which Marx uses in the German ideology. And I read this passage, and a lot of you must be familiar with it. He says, Marx says in the German ideology, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. So here the emphasis for me is on the abolition of the present state of things and real movement in that sense. And then I also tie up this quote from Marx with this small quote from Wendy Brown. You know, she's a professor in the US, from her book States of Injury, where she says, if Marxism had any analytical value for political theory, was it not in the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations, implicitly declared unpolitical, that is naturalized in liberal discourse? So here I try to highlight the fact that for Marx, freedom had to be located not in the political sphere of day-to-day representative parliamentary politics, but in social relations, in the capital-labor contradictions. So with these two quotes, I'll read some parts of my paper, and I hope I have time to do that. So for Marx, freedom cannot be located in the political realm, but it must be located in social relations involving the revolutionization of social relations, the abolition of the existing state of things, and hence a real movement, and not just mere contestation, counter-hegemony, and so on. Communism as a real movement derives from this foregrounding of social relations as the primary theater which sets the nature and character of all other instances and spheres in society. Locating freedom in the social relations, however, does not mean that social relations must be viewed as political in the sense of being subject to political, that is, democratic contestation, as is allowed within the political sphere under capitalism. In locating freedom in the social relations away from the political, and there you might seem that I'm making a very contentious point, in locating freedom in the social relations away from the political, Marx is calling for precisely the abolition of the existing state of things and not just democratic contestation, not the kind of reforms and reconfiguration of the economy, redistribution, that politics in capitalist democracy allows for. Hence, the otherwise radical slogan of everything is political, and you know, particularly after 1968, this became a major thing, everything is political, everything is ideological, and I tend to critique such a position without, however, giving up on the moment of truth that it represents. Hence, the otherwise radical slogan of everything is political must therefore be given a pass when it tries to politicize the economy, treat the economy as political. The important point is that the economy, social relations, is not political, within quotes, in the sense of being subject to democratic contestation. Social relations are political in the sense of being amenable, social relations are political in the sense of being not amenable to its abolition through the contestations of the bourgeois political sphere, but necessitating a revolutionary subjectivity and of communism as the real movement and the abolition of the existing state of things. In that sense, they are actually above politics, narrowly defined, within quotes. In that sense, the abolition of the existing state of affairs, the transformation of social relations are actually above politics, understood as the routine kind of conflicts in representative parliamentary democracy, but is also beyond a merely democratic opposition to capitalism, as represented by, say, social movements. For Marx, it was not really the shift from the purely political to the substantively economic or social, but this shift was, for Marx, from the realm of democratic contestation to one of revolutionary subjectivity and, in fact, revolutionary change. Now, this is a very crucial point for my presentation here, Because making the first shift, that is from purely political, saying bourgeois democracy is just formal, it doesn't give us substantive economic rights, and hence we should fight for economic rights and substantive rights, or community rights and that kind of a thing. Making this shift without the latter, that is from democratic opposition to capitalism to revolutionary subjectivity, without this latter shift meant merely emphasizing on economic rights, welfare state, or multicultural rights, or identity politics, and so on. Often this led one way or the other to social democracy, or post-Marxist new social movements, or different kinds of other libertarian movements. Extension of rights from the political sphere to the economic sphere, from formal to substantive rights, is one of the ways with the democratic illusion. The democratic illusion, which I suggest, is deeply invested in the dominant narrative of anti-capitalism as a moral critique, as ordinary people fighting the tyranny of big capital. It is sometimes populist, such a move invested in democratic opposition to capitalism, talking about only ordinary people opposing capital. Sometimes this is populist, sometimes it's social democratic, and sometimes libertarian. So maybe Holloway's anti-power stance maybe is something which I have in mind here. Ordinary people, marginalized communities, immigrant workers, sweatshop workers, and so on are portrayed as resisting capitalism, always in terms of their position as the marginalized and the exploited as ordinary people, but not as political subjects. And this is what I want to emphasize, the gap which is maintained between ordinary people and political subjects. Ben Said rightly points out the need to go beyond what he calls the Keynesian and neo-libertarian utopias of social movement anti-capitalism. Referring to the slogans like another world is possible, he emphasizes on the need to be specific about what the possible world is, and above all, to explore how to get there, which is a very, very valid point, and I agree with him. In fact, his piece is titled, which I told you earlier, the Return of Strategy. However, there is no clear attempt to break out of the paradigm of the moral critique of capitalism, or rather its excesses and horrors, to break with an anti-capitalism which precludes ordinary people emerging as political subjects. Without allowing for ordinary people superseding into a political subject, the call that there is an alternative to capitalism remains an empty slogan. That is, anti-capitalism, in its refusal to break with the democratic opposition to capitalism, winds up as an internal absent moment in the reproduction of capital, for the actualization of the alternative to capitalism cannot follow in its inexorable truth from ordinary people realizing how bad and immoral a system capitalism is, but from a possible actualization of effecting such an alternative in and through a revolutionary intervention of political subjects, of those who thereby are no longer ordinary people. As we pointed out above, it is the positing of an alternative to capitalism in the here and now, a positing which is also an intervention which then opens up the objective conditions in a way that an alternative as immanent movement now starts to appear. There is an alternative to capitalism. This slogan gets actualized in and through the commitment of a subjective imperative, the intervention of a revolutionary subjectivity. So it is such a communist hypothesis, such a presupposing, such a preparing for the revolution, which endows a political force to the slogan, there is an alternative to capitalism, a moral critique of capitalism caught within the limits of the political form of capitalist democracy, working through pointing out its horrors, ends up defining a mere oppositional relationship with capital and the state. Thus, the World Social Forum, for all its radical spirit and fervor, was merely in an oppositional relationship to capital. Similarly, I again quote from Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown shows the severe political limitations of critiquing capitalism from the standpoint of democracy, since, I quote, the politically exploitable hollowness in formal promises of freedom and democracy, and the politically exploitable hollowness in formal promises of freedom and equality has largely vanished, to the extent that both freedom and equality have been redefined by neoliberalism. This only means that oppositional consciousness cannot be generated from liberal democracy's false promises and hypocrisies. So basically, that we cannot rely on exposing capital and the state by saying, oh, you know, you make these genuine claims, but you never fulfill them. So there's this gap. So often the assumption among activists is that we need to tell ordinary people that, look, you know, our rulers are so bad, they're doing this. Yeah? And what Wendy Brown argues is that this space to exploit the hollowness of formal democracy is not really there today. You know, we need a different kind of a political initiative. I now will have a final section as my time is ticking away. Oh, not really. Oh, good to know. Oh, okay, yeah. I come to this interesting comment which David Harvey has made in his book. You know, he writes a lot of books, many books. So one is called Cosmopolitanism and the Geographies of Freedom. Maybe that is his latest. So in that, Harvey, he takes issues with what he calls the new radical left philosophers. Rancière, Badiou, Zizek, they're all taken to task there. So David Harvey takes issue with what he calls the new radical left philosophers, and in particular Badiou's emphasis on the event, by arguing that they refuse to engage in the concrete conditions, in the concreteness of things. He points out that the emphasis on the event, on the revolutionary gesture, leads, I quote, leads right back into that narcissistic, self-occupied world. I think this is far harsh than anything Tony Negri said yesterday. Leads back into that narcissistic, self-occupied world in which transcendence trumps actual political engagement, let alone the concrete issues of political organization and strategies. And somewhere else, he also says that what all these thinkers, Badiou, Zizek, Rancière, have in common is a certain fidelity to the event, the moment to the event, and the prioritization of process over the concreteness of things. And he also attacks Holloway. He says, for Holloway, becoming is all. So the moment of congealment is not there. So becoming is all for Holloway, and being is nothing. While Badiou, in the absence of contemporary events of any note, in the absence of contemporary events of any note, resorts simply to the purely relational idea, of fidelity to the fidelity as the core of contemporary political possibilities. So there are so many steps removed from reality that they're talking about not just fidelity to the event, but fidelity to that fidelity, you know. So this is David Harvey. Thus, it looks like the break with the norm of democracy, those who believe in the revolutionary subjectivity, the eventual moment, is glossing over the concrete socioeconomic relations that constitute capital and the state. Alberto Toscano, in another instance, points out Badiou's hostility to a communism based on any variety of socioeconomic immanence. Indeed, the event cannot be referred to internal dialectical relations, to the notion of contradiction in Badiou. As Badiou himself writes, an event is not the realization or variation of a possibility that resides inside the situation. Yeah, that an event is not the realization of a possibility that resides inside the situation, unquote. Badiou's thinking here seems to be formally of a piece with Rancière's methodological rejection of the science of the hidden, of the concrete, of the historical. Hence, Rancière's emphasis on equality follows from a notion of the political universal which emerges only in the course of subjectivation, without being tied to a determined historical project, to any ontology. So the emphasis on equality has no ontology, and it's not part of any historical project. It emerges only in the course of subjectivation. Thus, equality is a presupposition. It is not a founding ontological principle, but a condition that only functions when it is put into action. Almost sounds solipsistic. While such a notion of subjectivation and the political upholds the notion of the revolutionary universal, rupturing the social whole, it does not, of course, take us to any real movement. Yeah? So if it, indeed it is a idealistic, transcendental, revolutionary gesture, then such a revolutionary gesture will not take us to communism as real movement, since it treats the economy, the sphere of social relations, as positivistically given. And here I read Zizek as counter to Rancière, where, from his, afterward he has written to The Politics of Aesthetics, where Zizek is saying, critiquing Rancière for treating the sphere of social relations, for treating the economy as positivistically given, as an ontic sphere deprived of ontological dignity. Yeah? Having said that, however, so here you see a kind of clear division, yeah, between positing a purely revolutionary gesture and socioeconomic relations. But then we need to kind of slightly complicate this. Having said that, however, those purportedly taking account of the concrete, of the immanence of socioeconomic relations, as opposed to the empty revolutionary gesture of the new left philosophers, have often slipped into economism. So what you see is that those who emphasize on concrete socioeconomic relations, even class struggle, even anti-capitalism, are slipping into a kind of economism. And as you will see, I see there is a kind of a conjugation here. It's like economism plus democratic opposition to capitalism, yeah, on the one hand. So the critique of a Badiouian kind of a position of revolutionary gesture might be well taken, but what we see is that that critique is often coming from a particular kind of a strand of thinking where you see which slips into economism, yeah? And one of the reasons it slips into economism, in spite of emphasizing on the class struggle, in spite of emphasizing on anti-capitalism, is that of the fact that they believe they're too invested in the democratic opposition to capitalism and not going beyond that, yeah? So in the present context, they get out of the social illusion. Those who are critiquing the supposed idealist transcendental revolutionary gesture, they get out of the social illusion only to dissipate in the democratic illusion. They might not have gotten bogged down in parliamentarism or parliamentary politics, but they have not been able to break out of the unwritten rule of democratic opposition to capitalism, and hence remain wedded to a framework which forever talks of an alternative to capitalism without invoking the revolutionary subjectivity adequate to such a task. Or the other position is a Negri kind of a position talking about self-regulated multitude, immanent productive subjectivity. So even that seems to dissipate in the ongoing immanent process of capitalism. However, our emphasis on social relations necessarily entailing a break with democracy, as we know of today, communism as a real movement, and the revolutionary intervention which will assert the freedom and universality with which the proletarian standpoint can break with the determinations of capital and the state, such a formulation allows us to go beyond the empty revolutionary gesture, the miracle of the event, without lapsing into economism plus democratic opposition formula, which has become some kind of an entrenched common sense of large sections of the left today. David Harvey definitely makes a valid point in his critique of the new left philosophers, but there is nothing in his emphasis on the concrete conditions which does not lead us to economism plus democratic opposition to capitalism formula. And then I have some more points here. This is where perhaps we need to reread Lenin today and see how the emphasis on revolutionary struggle, on the revolutionary intervention, did not put the question of social relations in the back burner. If we look at Lukács's study of Lenin, yeah, Lukács. If we look at Lukács's study of Lenin, then we see very clearly that revolutionary intervention, the subjective intervention of the party, is posited only in the context of the field of social relations as the terrain of what is possible and what is not. It is only after formulating an understanding of the objective conditions, the existing social relations, its effects in class terms, the new class alignments that arise from it, that the question of organization, the revolutionary intervention of the party, is enunciated. However, while class struggle in the very heart of objective conditions provides the basis, the socio-economic grounding for revolutionary intervention,
this intervention can remain revolutionary without dissipating into economism, democratic opposition, or trade unionism, only if it carries through the task of preparing for the revolution. Among these tasks are the concentration on the ideological evolution of the proletariat and the development of the political forms of political power in order to replace the existing state apparatus and its political institutions. Thus, Lukács foregrounds and almost celebrates Lenin's grand revolutionary daring without for a moment flinching from setting this against the concrete socio-economic conditions of Russia of the time. For Lenin, proletarian revolutionary subjectivity is intricately bound with the party, the organization, which then mediates the relationship with the concrete socio-economic relations. However, the conditions that make this subjectivity possible are the objective conditions, the socio-economic relations obtaining in Russia at the time. Thus, it is no paradox that in Lukács, the chapter, it's very interesting, the chapter dealing with the objective conditions and the stage of capitalist development of Russia is called the proletariat as the leading class. And it sounds so subjectivist, revolutionary subjectivist kind of a heading. And yet that is the chapter in which he's able to tell you about the objective necessity of capitalist development, all of that, yeah? So you see this kind of convergence of the subjective and the objective there. That is, the proletariat's subjective revolutionary role is arrived at in and through the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. It is precisely this insight which must be grasped in its full revolutionary significance and historical depth. The proletariat's leading role cannot run counter to the recognition of the necessity of capitalist development in Russia. It must recognize in Lukács' interpretation of Lenin, it must recognize this necessity only so that it can accordingly place itself in the leading role in order to carry on the class struggle. Writes Lukács, the proletariat must welcome it. That is the necessity of capitalist development that you can't stop, and it inevitably has to happen. The proletariat must welcome it, for it alone establishes the basis of its own appearance as the decisive force. But it must welcome it as the condition and the premise of its own bitter struggle against the real protagonist of capitalism, against the bourgeoisie. Similarly, class struggle and the proletariat's leading role comes into focus, again, with reference to the recognition of the necessary dissolution of the vestiges of agrarian communism in the context of building socialism in a backward country like Russia of the time. So even on this question of, because it's supposedly not as advanced a country, it doesn't have an advanced capitalism as the Western Europe, even this question of how the land question, the peasantry question is going to be resolved, even that, which is an objective situation, is understood and analyzed in such a way that the revolutionary subjectivity of the proletariat gets foregrounded, yeah? So there's an objective analysis of objective conditions, concrete analysis, concrete conditions, but which already presupposes a proletarian standpoint. And that is what allows you to take a revolutionary subjective position. And here, Lenin had pointed out two solutions to the agrarian question. One was the sweeping away of all medieval feudal vestiges from the lives of the peasantry, which was a progressive revolutionary resolution. And the other was what he calls the Prussian way, characterized by the legacy of medieval landed property not being abolished all at once, but gradually adapted to capitalism. This was the bourgeois democratic resolution. Now, in that period in Russia, both these possibilities were economically progressive and could have happened. But then, what decides? This is what Lukács asks. What then decides which of the two is destined to become reality? Lenin's answer to this question, as to any other, is clear and unambiguous. It's the class struggle which will decide. Further, in this class struggle, given their objective class position, it is clearly the proletariat which comes to be the decisive force. Here again, it is an understanding of the objective conditions and objective necessity of the socio-economic relations which allows us to posit the proletariat as the leading class, as the revolutionary class. 5 minutes. Revolutionary subjectivity is based on the leading role of the proletariat as a class, the latter in turn emanating from the objective conditions regarding the development of capitalism in Russia at the time. Now, this seems to be an argument which might favor someone like, say, something like David Harvey's position, talking about the socioeconomic concrete situations. However, the crucial point is that, one, the class struggle appears as such. The proletariat's revolutionary subjectivity is recognized as such only with the assertion of the subjectivity of the proletariat. Lenin was able to see the clear leading role of the proletariat not as a sociologically given class, which will fight for its interests, but as advancing a proletarian class outlook, since he was prepared to go all the way in breaking with the determinations of capital and the state. Thus, it is in consistently adopting, in fact, foregrounding the proletarian standpoint, working through all its ramifications, that the concrete conditions could be seen to lend itself to being transformed by proletarian subjectivity and towards socialism, communism. Now, what are these ramifications? What are these concrete determinations with capital and the state that needs to be broken in order for you to see that the concrete conditions, in fact, lend itself to an advancement towards socialism? More specifically, there are two important factors that Lenin took into account in order to advance the proletarian standpoint. They were the question of the ideological evolution of the proletariat in the context of the rise of a labor aristocracy. Second, and very crucially, was the question of the political form of the economic emancipation of labor, the development of Soviets. And that is where you can break with capital, with the form of capitalist democracy, the political form of capitalism. What is therefore very clear is that it is not concrete conditions, as in the very situation in Russia during 1917, the revolutionary crisis of those days and so on, which alone gave rise to the possibility of class struggle and the leading role of the proletariat. Rather, the concrete conditions were rendered revolutionary and amenable to the revolution in the light of Lenin and his party positing a revolutionary subjectivity and unflinchingly advancing the proletarian standpoint and subjectivity. Thus, the actuality of revolution cannot be detached from the other idea of preparing for the revolution. And here, work on the ideological evolution of the proletariat and the development of the Soviet as political forms, as the form of the new proletarian state, were of crucial importance. In other words, and I will end in a minute, in other words, concrete conditions could be read to engender a particular revolutionary subjectivity only if this subjectivity is advanced in a way which is willing to break with the determinations of concrete conditions, vice the determinations imposed by the labor aristocracy and the lack of a political form for proletarian power. Now, I just have one last section which will kind of try to sum up the main argument, is that so to wrap up the thing, as I've mentioned earlier, overloading ordinary people, coming back to the ordinary people argument, overloading ordinary people with stories of the horrors of capitalism and of the greed and corruption of its rulers, while refusing to view them as political subjects who might go beyond merely a democratic opposition to capitalism, then, as we argued earlier, overlooks the fact that the attachment to capital and the commodity does not go away without a radical subjectivity which transforms the very coordinates of what is possible. But then, if locating freedom in the sphere of social relations, as we mentioned earlier, if therefore locating freedom in the sphere of social relations and the break with capitalist democracy it entails does not slowly develop as the unfolding of democratic opposition to capitalism, then what does it mean for our idea of communism as real movement? It clearly means that communism cannot but be a presupposition, a practical attitude, complementing the immanent unfolding of the logic of capitalism into communism. It is an understanding of the objective conditions from the standpoint of this presupposition of communism, which brings out the class struggle in its true light. This presupposition is not an empty idealist one, but involves positing the freedom and universality with which the proletariat can break with the determinations of capital and the state, a total break where the expropriators shall be expropriated. And this break I'm talking about, where, this this break with the determinations of capital and the state, and the presupposition of communism which it involves, and yet it's not going to be idealist, is something which in the one phase of the communist movement that we saw in India, there was this debate about democratic struggle versus versus underground illegal armed struggle. And in that, it is often seen that whenever the mass movement, the mass democratic struggle, becomes really radical and challenges the system, there was heavy state repression, yeah, as you can imagine. And so one argument was that, no, as we do the democratic struggle, the reason why we got repressed, totally finished off by the state, was because our movement was not broad enough. We didn't have more and more ordinary people with us. But the other thinking, which I identify myself with, and something which I hope comes through in this paper as well, was that to take into account the reality of state repression from the very beginning. Yeah, and something what I think even Saroj Giri talks about, to begin from the beginning again, some kind of ramification of that, which is that you take into, even when you are doing democratic struggle, you have to already take into account right from day one the possibility of state repression. That means all the ways through which you might be determined by capital and the state has to be already posited at the very beginning in order for you to see the possibility of a revolutionary subjectivity. So it's not a kind of gradualist thing from democratic opposition, you then reach a radical insurrection. No, the possibility of that has to be already posited before, and that's where the idea of preparing for the revolution becomes very important. And that's where, for me, the notion of a party is still very important, because if you don't have a party, how will you prepare for the revolution? How will you already presuppose all that is going to happen? Yeah? So the point then is that if you are breaking with the idea of democratic opposition to capitalism, I see it extremely difficult to also break with the notion of the party. Thank you.